I think the future of educating India should be a very exciting space. There are traditional modes that India has used, and there's been some success with that. But I think the time is right to really play with a whole variety of things. The availability of technology makes, I think, new possibilities, available to people. I think that there's some redefinition, reconceptualizing of what is needed. Both the what you want to teach or what you want kids to learn and how are undergoing some change. So for example, I think that our traditional education systems are very individual oriented, excellence oriented, and that's where our entire examination system is kind of funneling people in that direction. But we see increasingly effectiveness when you work in groups, when kids do things together, which is much harder to assess, is maybe much harder to track, but you can see that the overall confidence, the overall capacity of kids are growing. So how do you bring this kind of a more collaborative, more applied kinds of learning into an education system which is used to being quite rigid and straightforward? But I think the reason I'm optimistic is, you of course see exciting things happening around you, but if you look at the way industry or even higher education is now accepting, what is the entry path? At least in industry, for a large number of jobs, they basically it's learning on the job. So you come in because you have some characteristics, but after that, really your progress is determined by what you're doing. And I don't know how we can bring this kind of a mindset even into the way our education system operates. But I think that there are pushes and pulls, there are global trends that are going to affect us. And I think the fact that today you have, as compared to some years ago, you have almost the entire cohort of kids of a certain age reaching, whether it's 8th grade or 10th grade, and that puts pressures on a system that is used to being dealing only with 20% getting there. So I'm very confident that young people and children will push us, and we will have to change. So Pratham's journey is about 25 years. So I'll be brief. I think over time we've learned many things, but we started, right at the very beginning, about in Mumbai, then called Bombay. Our beginning was to figure out what was the gap in the education system, and then kind of begin our work from there. And at the time in Bombay, school systems were of course there, and any school system can improve further, but we saw a big gap in the early childhood space. A lot of migrants coming into the city, often dislocated people, who had left things behind, come into town, and connecting their kids to school was sometimes not the top priority. So we started with actually doing community-based little early childhood centers. And even then, our approach was not just that we want to do this for the kids and help the transition into school, but really help the parents and the families be connected to schools further. Over the years, our sort of mission has been every child in school and learning well. And so the early years was those who were either left out or getting in, how do you help them to do so? But as India's enrollment levels have gone up, our focus has been largely on kids who are in school but not learning well. And I would say the last 15 years, we've really been working on how do you help this catch up happen. And we are at the point today where I think that how you help catch up happen, we figured out a lot of very effective ways of doing that. We are now beginning to focus on sort of a leap forward. How do you help families, schools, and children get foundations, strong foundations built in time, so that you don't even have the learning problem that you see today. And so I think that what we've learned is identifying, a gap, really working hard to figure out what is an effective solution that can use local resources that can be scaled, fairly effectively, and then how do you share that with other people? So that's kind of our own personal learning journey. And as far as kids are concerned, I think, we've learned many things, but one of them is that kids like to feel that there is progress. And so if you have goals that you think are achievable, you help kids understand where you're headed, and you help them feel quick success, I think that fuels their own, path forward. So I think that we've learned many things, but I think that one thing that we had an instinct for right in the beginning, and we have continued to kind of reinforce that view, is that anything you do in education should have obviously a component in school, which is where most people focus. But I think it's really important to carry families and communities along. If you really want big transformation, I think big transformations happen when these forces work together. So, governments and teachers are as important as parents. And somehow, in countries where education levels are not very high, especially not for, say, previous generations, parents tend to get left out. Because as soon as kids move into, higher grades, you feel these guys are not going to be able to help. And so I think a big lesson is, how do you carry people along? How do you encourage more people who don't normally participate to be supportive of the kids in their community or in their families? And I think the motivation to learn is really important. You don't, kids don't learn in isolation. When there is a culture of learning, culture of curiosity around, and the curiosity doesn't have to be academic curiosity. It could be, for example, I remember talking to a elderly lady in a village and her granddaughter, and they were discussing that when you fry a what we call a puri, why does it stay up? And there was some really good discussion going on between the grandmother and the kid. So I think, how do you have these kinds of that learning is not just a book and a classroom and an exam, but a much bigger thing that people tend to do their whole life, and make the connections between what's happening out there to what you're doing.